What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're going to take a look at Final Fantasy XVI here on the ROG Ally X. Finally getting this game over on the PC. It's not necessarily the cleanest port right now. Hopefully we'll get some updates that help it out a little bit, because it does have some different stutter issues and performance issues, and it certainly does run a bit lower than I originally anticipated. But let's go ahead and get into it, and we'll take a look at all the settings I'm trying out here and do a little comparing and take a look at performance here for Final Fantasy XVI. As far as the settings, we're going to have some options here that we're going to mess around with, even though I'll typically use FSR 3 in the video. There's Intel's XeSS 1.3 in here, as well as FSR 1, and of course our quality, balance, performance, and all that for upscaling. We have in-game frame gen, which we'll be taking a look at, and we're going to be using all low settings here, and I'm not using variable rate shading. Pretty much got to go this way because the game is heavy to run and it's difficult to get performance out of this. I'm also going to be 720p here, even though we'll talk a little bit about some of the other resolutions. So here we are, low, FSR 3 balance, 25 watts, 720p. And if we compare it to XeSS, and I'm just throwing this in here because typically XeSS offers a little bit better and smoother performance than FSR, which kind of is the case still here. But what's interesting is usually XeSS is more clear, but in this case it seems like FSR 3 really is a lot clearer. When you're looking at the rocks and the trees and all the stuff, perfectly matched settings. XeSS just doesn't do as well of a job in this particular game with the upscaling. So I'm sticking with FSR 3 here, and because I want to use in-game frame gen, that makes sense anyways. As far as wattage, 25 watts, you can certainly mess around with 17, 18, 20, 22, whatever you want for performance, but of course each time you come down in your wattage, you're going to lose a little bit of performance in the game. So we'll come down from 39 to 34, just sitting still here if we come down to 18 watts, and we're not even getting busy where we're going to need more performance out of the CPU and GPU here. So just keep that in mind when you're messing around with what performance you want to get there. Bump this back up to 20 watts. We'll come up in between that, 34 and 39 to about 37. 20 watts is kind of a sweet spot for me here on this processor, but I bounce around between 18 and 25 depending on what I'm playing. Back over to 25, which is what we're going to concentrate on here. Handheld mode, 25 watts, getting the most performance I can get out of the game. And of course we also have in-game frame generation, which we'll take a closer look at after we take a look at performance without, but that works pretty well in the game and I think is worth using for the performance. Also, as far as other resolutions, 1080p is completely unplayable with this game no matter what with FSR. 900p here is pretty rough depending on where you're at, and you'd have to introduce some more upscaling beyond balance to really get there, because in other areas it even does get worse. And here from 26, if I switch back over to 720p here, we'll go back up to about 30-31. There's just a big difference in performance. It's not worth it for me. This game just isn't running that great. It's pretty heavy. Gonna stick with 720p here in the video, and probably if I'm playing. Of course, as we move around, performance goes out the window here in this spot anyway, but it was a good spot to show that. Now, as far as the demo area of the game, or the beginning area, it actually ran pretty good and gave us hope of a little better performance in my opinion. But luckily the cutscenes here on the Ally X, at least the ones I've seen so far in the first 4 or 5 hours, seem to be working pretty well. Rarely am I getting stutters or issues here coming in and out of those cutscenes, which is good, at least on this device. I'm having issues on other PCs. And combat performance was pretty good in the demo areas as well. But once you play a few hours and you get deeper into the game and you start exploring other areas, just like that town I showed you at 900p and 720p, your performance really does start to go. And in combat and in other areas of the game, you are going to oftentimes, almost always, be down in the 30s, and from time to time you may even dip lower than that. There are certainly areas of the game that still pop back up into the 40s and even 50s, depending on where you're at. With no frame gen, it works just fine, but there's areas that'll also come down into the 20s on you as well in combat when you're playing too. So it's just going to be all over the place depending on where you're at, what settings you're using, the wattage available, and all that type of thing. Again, this area running can be rough, and there's some other town areas I've run into and stuff where things can just get a little bit janky as well, but fortunately no real combat or anything in those areas. And some of the boss fights and stuff so far have not been too bad. I'm not getting any major stutter issues or problems for me anyway that are making it to where playing, dodging, you know, doing the fights and all that is really a problem. So it's not taking away from my experience here, at least in the battles I've been in so far with most of the bosses, or in some of the mobs and stuff, taking them out. Even as things get pretty nutty here, look, 32 FPS was about our lowest here that we're going to drop to, but yeah, just expect to be kind of everywhere. You might want to do a 30 FPS lock if you're really trying to get into it here with Final Fantasy XVI. Now let's take a look at in-game frame gen. A couple of those same areas, this area was running in the 30s and what, 27, 28 FPS we looked at. And we got clean frame times with good performance here, staying in the 50s and 60s for this area when we go back here. Same boss here, taking a look, we're getting the 70s and 80s for performance here instead of the 40s, and the additional input latency from in-game frame generation currently really just isn't that bad. I don't notice it a lot. I had the same thing in Black Myth Wukong, Cyberpunk. I really think it's worth running it on these devices and taking advantage of the feature if you want to try to pull that performance out of it, and you're not getting any additional latency or input latency or anything that's causing you any problems. I thought it felt fine and didn't really have a big difference between having frame gen on or off, but I thought the game looked really good on the VRR screen playing on the Ally X this way and taking advantage of in-game frame generation. So I recommend at least trying it out, maybe going back and forth and seeing if maybe that'll work for you if you're not totally happy with the lower FPS that the game tend to gets in a lot of the areas. Try the in-game frame gen. I think it's working really well here, and I'll probably continue to use it. But yeah, having de novo in here is probably not helping with some of that, and I've lost access to some of my other devices for a little while because you can only do 4 at a time, and I'm trying to do a lot of tests here. But I was able to get back on the Ally X and get this one finished up, and except for some jankiness here and there in some areas, I'm okay with the performance here. I think the game could certainly use some updates to smooth out and maybe increase performance for us there, but ultimately when you get things running good here, I think it's very playable and enjoyable here, at least for me, on the ROG Ally X. Anyways guys, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thanks a lot for coming to check out the video as always. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.